Hello, welcome back to the art studio. Today I'm going to teach you how we can turn a green object into a red project by painting it. Of course, if you are following along with this series, you know that I am working from Arthur Stern's book, How to See Color and Paint It. This is a very well-known book if you want to know more about the project and the layout. Of course, this is going to be linked in a playlist. I recommend you check out the first couple videos where I lay out the scope. But all you need to know for this video is that I am doing projects. It kind of mimics, in my opinion, sort of a painting 1 and 2 in a college setting. So it's not super advanced painting. We're covering the basics, but in a very sort of accelerated academic way. And part of how this works is that we are assigned a project where we have one key insight that changes the way we know the world into the way we should see the world. I know that might feel a little bit abstract, but truly the art of painting and painting representationally revolves around the idea of challenging the way you see things and undoing certain biases that, to be fair, help you navigate the real world, but when you sit down to actually paint them can be to your detriment. All that to say, today we are looking at how a color that is objectively, in this case, green, can actually end up being red depending on the lighting and the circumstances surrounding our green block. And just to show you really quickly before we jump into the time-lapse portion, this is the block that I used. I painted it green. It's the same green that I actually used more or less to paint the block. So it is really true blue, well, in this case green, local color. And we can see that the opposite side is, it's hard to tell. It doesn't look strongly red, but it is in fact reflecting some of this red background, and it's also contrasted to the more vibrant Kelly green on the actual block. That creates a gray that kind of falls into the maroon, therefore sort of the red family. Truthfully, it's more of a neutral, but one of the key points that Arthur Stern teaches about, and one way that we can better understand color, is by using the chromatic hue term for as long as possible. Basically, he calls them dirty words, and it is brown and gray and black and white. He says resist using those in lieu of a color word. So in this case, very, very dark muted red, even though truly it is a shade of black. But let's hop into the time lapse. And I should also say that if you want to see this time lapse in real time and ask me questions directly and work through the book, I recommend joining my online art school, Not Sari Art School. This year, I am, of course, hopping on a live every other week and painting this in real time, answering questions, and really walking you through all the steps of painting this at time. If that sounds interesting to you, check out the link below. You can use the code to get a discount if you would like to join as a lifetime member, but let's jump into the video. So with project 3, this is our last week where we are working on our first impression. Basically, in the book, Arthur Stern asks us to work from general to specific, which, if you followed me for any length of time, is nothing new. That's kind of a marquee principle that I teach whenever I'm teaching how to paint. Start with the big. In fact, one of my favorite quotes of all time is in this book, and Arthur Stern says, well begun is half done. That is to say that if you are really kind of focused on making sure that your big color spots, aka the value, how light or how dark a color is, as well as the hue, is this red, is this dark maroon, etc. As long as those things are relatively accurate and in the right spot, that is an excellent foundation of which we can build detail on. As always, I'm starting with a middle gray surface. This helps us to better gauge our values. I learned this in college, and if I ever need to really lock in, if I'm doing something that has a challenging value structure to it, I will always start with this middle gray color. And then of course, I am picking out the big color forms. So for example, I'm making sure that I paint the red plane and the yellow plane and the blue floor one solid color. In the following weeks, we'll break this up and we start to really get a better realistic sense of life, a more naturalistic look to our painting. So if you're following along and you're like, well, these look kind of simple, yes, you're right. We level up, should I say, in the next course and begin to find more detail. I think the painting book becomes a lot more fun after this point, but back to what we're doing here. So one thing I made sure to note in the live is that when we're looking specifically at the cube, you want to make sure that you're really analyzing what I call local color. I don't believe that Arthur Stern uses that definition specifically in the book, but local color is the color of the thing. So in this case, I used the same acrylic paints that I'm painting this image with to also mix the green that I painted my little cube with. And as tempting as it might be to mix that same ratio of phthalo green yellow shade as well as my cad yellow lemon or my cad yellow light together to make that, you always want to make sure that you account for atmosphere. And atmosphere is basically sort of the light and fog and water vapor and conditions that give things a little more of a lifelike perspective. If you've ever seen someone paint a mountain vista or an oceanscape and it kind of turns foggy and bluish in the background, then likely what you're noticing is a very visible atmosphere. Painters often have to account for this as well, so I made sure to add a little bit of a color complement to that green, in this case likely some sort of a red, in order to bump that down just a little bit. And we can see the 3 different visible planes of the cube. We know that the local color of the top of our green cube as well as the side in shadow is technically a green. It is very close to the green that is the front face of our cube. And yet, because the light is coming from slightly above and because there is a yellow wall behind the cube, the top is reflecting that yellow light, and it's also lighter in value because it is receiving more of that light. And so we're accounting for that. And then of course, our most dramatic shift is with the shadow side. Because in our light box, Arthur Stern directs us to have a directional source of light, we have a very harsh and direct shadow. This means that we're gonna have really big value breaks. So think about if you're looking at a portrait of someone, if there's lots of light, it's like an overcast day, it's diffused lights, you're gonna have shadows, but they're gonna be very light and soft and not super stark. However, if you've ever taken a photo of someone where it's like flash photography or one very direct light source, like an overhead light, you know that there is shadows galore. And that's because lighting informs not only sort of how light or how dark something is, but it also informs the directness of the shadow. And in this case, it's much, much darker because it doesn't have light on it. And then also compared to the planes that do have the light, there's just gonna be that color contrast, sort of a Joseph Albers analysis, something light next to something very dark. The dark is gonna seem darker, the light is gonna seem lighter just because they are next to each other. As well as the fact that there's also a little bit of the bounced light from our red wall behind bouncing onto this. So because of this, what may have started out a very dark, very muted green, another key thing to note is that things that are in shadow that are receiving less light, not only are they darker because they're receiving less light, which is I think the more obvious observation here, they also tend to be less chromatic. Things that are receiving a lot of light tend to have more color. Obviously, there is a threshold where things become overexposed. I will say when you're painting from life, things don't tend to be as overexposed. So when you're observing and painting from life, it's a little bit more uniform that the thing that is receiving the most light tends to be very near the most chromatic thing that you're looking at. Obviously, there's exceptions to that, but that's a rule of thumb generally. And because of this, we sort of have to do what I like to think of as like color math, right? It's on one hand, you can use your spot finder tool and isolate the color, and that certainly is going to get you to a really good point, a starting point. But then you also have to sort of look at the equation, so to speak. And if we see that there is red light bouncing on, we sort of ask ourselves, is this redder than all of the other things around it? And in this case, not only are we comparing the side of the cube to the other sides of the cube, but we're also comparing that particular shade of dark, dark red to the cast shadow, which is of course on the floor. And in this case, it is a dark blue. It also has some of the green bouncing in it. And again, because it is in shadow, it tends to be a little bit more muted because there's less light shining on it. Less light means less vibrancy, etc. Arthur Stern states in the book that there are going to be 7 color spots. I find this to be a very helpful element to his book. He really, really, really wants you to be accurate but simple. Accurate but simple. And one of the ways he does this is by saying, hey, you're only going to mix 7 colors and lay them down. Again, as I mentioned earlier, as the book goes on, you will break those simple spots and simple planes down into more and more increasingly elaborate and detailed observations. But the nice thing about the simplicity of this shows you that you really only have to have a few very accurate observations, and then you can sort of build on that almost like a foundation to a house. Or if you're building the cake, it's kind of like the cake layer that does all the work, even if it's not the prettiest. And then of course the icing sits on top and gets all the credit. And finally, I like to touch on the observations. So for every project, that Arthur Stern has in this book. He ends with an observation, and he basically says, after seeing that white can look darker than black in Project 1, if you remember, this is the toilet paper roll that has a very, very dark front. And he also says, and that black can be full of color, perhaps even lighter in white, in our second project with our black cube. You won't be surprised to see green turn into a shade of red. But he also makes sure to round it out. So one thing we always have to think about, and I'll leave you with this, is that as a painter, we are kind of having to break down a puzzle and then reassemble it, right? We're breaking down what we see into simple, accurate observations with our color checker, and with this knowledge that what we see can't always be trusted, and we have to be really scrupulous and sort of double check everything with these parameters that we are learning in this book. But he also reassures us that whenever we simplify our observations, as tempting as it would be to paint this green cube and the 3 visible sides as just 3 different shades of green, we have to trust that when we incorporate the red bounced light onto our shadow, that the viewer is not going to think that they're looking at a cube that has 2 green sides and then 1 red side, but rather the subconscious observation of a viewer, even someone who has never taken an art class in their life, you will be able to understand that that is bounce light, even if you're not aware of it. The best analogy I have for this is I always tell my students, think about if you're a native English speaker, you probably didn't formally learn what is called the King's Order, and it's the order that adjectives go in before you describe a noun. So the big brown dog, we all know that there is a very specific order of that, and yet we sort of automatically know to do that. We have to understand that the viewer, and to some extent ourselves, is understanding the world visually at a subconscious level, and that is mostly how we see things in our day-to-day life. For example, if you were to see a white sheet hung up on a clothesline on a very sunny day, there would likely be a pattern where the wind is blowing in the sheet, where it would be lit in some spots and shadows in others, almost creating a vertical or diagonal stripe effect. We don't look at that and go, oh, that is a bluish gray and white striped blanket or sheet. We know that the white casts shadows on an almost subconscious level. So as uncanny as it might be to mix a shade of almost like a red and put it on this clearly green cube, if we trust our observations and really stick to this method of observing and seeing and painting, we can trust that our viewer will subconsciously be able to decode this, and it's actually going to add a layer of richness and accuracy and naturalistic interpretation that's only going to serve you as a painter and make you better at this task. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully it was helpful. Stay tuned for me to complete the rest of this book. I am, of course, filming these a couple weeks in advance, aka the Not Sari Art School students are already up to project 5, I believe. And so I can't emphasize enough how important it is to join us on this journey and watch us paint these together. My students have been working on this in our Kajabi community and sharing what they're doing, and some people are working with brushes, and you get the reference photo in there. So if you really want to dive into this book with a instructor, I can't recommend becoming a lifetime student enough. Either way, you can gain a lot from the YouTube videos as well as the accompanying blogs, which of course are public. I'd love to see what you're making. If you want to tag me, my Instagram is Not Sari Art School Instagram, and I'd love to check it out there. All that to say, happy painting, keep observing, and I'll see you in the next video.